Hello and welcome back to Mass Media, aka Electronic Media. We are up to class 13, and that brings us to computers and the internet, and that is a big enough subject that it will take us 2 classes in order to cover everything. So let's get started. So we're going to do a brief history of computers and the internet, and remember, history isn't just a whole bunch of old stuff, okay, that happened in the past. History is what is going to allow us to predict the future. Okay, if we want to know what's going to happen in the future, we can check the past, and that is a pretty good indicator. Okay, so this is important stuff, not just old stuff. So, 1834, Charles Babbage, the father of the computer, and he is the person that came up with the analytical engine, and that was a general purpose mechanical, okay, not electronic, not in the 1830s it wasn't, computer. This is a recreation of one. That's not the actual one, but this is a recreation of one in a museum or university in Great Britain. And we're going to jump way far, almost 100 years, but we have to talk about Charles Babbage and his analytical engine. Next up, we have a very important person in all this. You may have even already heard of him, Alan Turing. There is a Turing test and things like that. He has an interesting story, and he conceived of a logical computing machine, became known as a Turing machine, and he wrote lots of papers about how all this would work. And interestingly, a lot of the people that come up with, that are so important in science, don't actually build stuff. They conceive of stuff, and they do calculations and things like that. And our example is Albert Einstein. And he just did everything on paper. That's all he did. He didn't have anything to do with rocketry or with telescopes or any of that. He just wrote papers and did a pretty darn good job. We all know about Albert Einstein and the predictions that are still coming true all these many years later. And so that, in essence, what Alan Turing was doing. He didn't build any computers or anything like that. For the most part, he was writing papers and conceiving of how these analytical engines, computing machines would work. And interestingly, the word computer used to mean the person, like teacher or farmer. Okay, the person that did numbers was a computer. And of course, once we had machines that could compute math, and that's really the main reason that people were looking for computers, was to do math. That's the main thing. And so the human computer becoming the machine computer, and we have the Turing machine. He had some work also. This is also very important, and a movie was made about it, and so on. And that is working on the German Enigma codes from World War II. This is a rebuilt version of, and I love it's B-O-M-B-E, bomb. And the Germans had an amazing code machine, the Enigma machine, and it wasn't a simple A equals B and B equals C or something like that, where you just find a dial and switch everything. There's 4 letters, and then a space, and then 6 letters, and then a space, and so on. That's really basic. That's really basic coding, and that's not the sort of thing that they needed to break. This is much more difficult than that. The best minds really couldn't solve it. And so they thought that a machine might possibly be able to do the calculations. It's just way too many calculations for them to figure out. And so Turing worked on building this machine. We can see it is tubes and things like that, which makes it very, very big. And we're going to talk later about transistors and microchips and all the stuff that helped make computers much smaller. But back in the 1930s and 1940s, it was all about tubes, and he worked on that and with a team, and they made a very exciting film, I think, called The Imitation Game. And here we have good old Benedict Cumberbatch as Alan Turing, and there is a nice physical resemblance, I think. It's not bad. Okay. And I don't know if Turing was on the autism spectrum or not. Some people that are so brilliant and so focused and so on. He seems a little bit like that in the movie as acted by Benedict Cumberbatch. Some of these brilliant people are not very socially adept, not very good at asking people things for help and questions and all that kind of stuff. The other part of Turing's story that makes him very interesting is the fact that he was gay. A homosexual in England was against the law at that time. And I think a number of people probably knew, but as long as he sort of kept it quiet and in the closet and all of that, then everything was going to be okay. The very sad part of Turing's story is that in the early 1950s, after he helped save Britain, after he helped win the war with this machine that could break the codes, and you know, when you break a code, then you know that the German submarines are going to be here, and you know that the battle is going to be fought here. They're either going to withdraw or they're going to attack. It's really important when you can break a code. And communication is very important in war. In World War I, they were doing it with wires and things like that. But in World War II, they weren't doing that. Now, as a side point, the Americans had people that could speak a very, very obscure and ancient language, and I believe it was Cherokee. Maybe it's not Cherokee, but they were speaking a Native American language. It might have been Navajo code breakers. I'm trying to think if it was Navajo. Maybe it was Navajo. Anyway, no Germans could speak that language, and very, very few Americans could speak the language, and very, very few Navajo could speak the language. So they could send language across on lines, on phones and things like that, and there wasn't anybody around that could break that. So anyway, that's a little bit of a side point. That's a really tough code to break. But as soon as you find somebody that can speak Navajo or Cherokee or one of those languages that I don't even know if it was even written down, then then the game's over. But anyway, Alan Turing was gay, and it was against the law. And at a point in the early 1950s, there was a burglary in his house, and he reported it to the police. And when the police got there, they found 2 sets of male clothes and a toothbrush and things like that. And they deduced that there was another male living there and that he was homosexual. And they gave him a choice of chemical castration or prison. Some choice, huh? Chemical castration or prison. He chose the third choice of suicide. So very sad for Alan Turing. He has since, this sounds ridiculous, but he has since been pardoned by maybe the Queen. I'm not sure. I think it was the Queen. He actually got pardoned. I mean, he's a national hero, right? But he finally, 50 years later, he was pardoned. His crimes were struck from his record, from his permanent record. And of course, they're making movies about him, very, very famous Turing machines, and all sorts of other stuff. So Alan Turing is really one of these pioneers, mostly for the papers he was writing, but a important person nevertheless. So these early computers filled a room. This is 1945, right at the end of the war. This is ENIAC, and the first electronic programmable general purpose computer. So it's not just having one purpose, like break a code. Okay, so that machine that they built, Turing and his gang, it only had one thing to do. Okay, it wasn't going to do ballistics. It wasn't going to do any of that kind of stuff. It was going to break that code. But everybody could tell that a general purpose machine would be much more useful. So ENIAC, all those tubes and everything, you can see it's on rollers and everything, so they can sort of roll it around. When they need to add more, they can just roll it in and start patching it. It's patched. These are patch cords, patch panels, and things like that. That is what tiny little wires in transistors and chips do today. Thinner than a human hair is going to replace all of these big, thick, old cables and wires and things like that. And that's how they got so small. And speaking of the transistor, once it comes out, tubes are out and transistors come in, and that was done at Bell Labs. So that's not a government agency, that's a private company, and they had a hand in many developments in technology, all sorts of technology, rockets, breaking the sound barrier, the Bell X1, I think it was, a lot of stuff over at Bell Labs, of course taking its name from Alexander Graham Bell from the telephone. And so they are going to replace tubes, and tubes can heat up and burn out and all that kind of stuff. So now we have transistor radios, nice and small, and it was a big thing. Instead of these big tube radios, small enough to be portable. And when we talked about music, we talked about how music became portable with the transistor radio, and then of course that morphed into cassette players and DVD players and pods and all that kind of stuff. But that was the first portable music system that you could go right around with and put some headphones on and all the whole rest of it. 1959, we get the microchip, and this is invented at Texas Instruments, famous for their calculators and things like that. We're getting smaller and smaller. Remember, that is replacing a good bit of this. Okay, so that is replacing all of that big stuff. That's the microchip. And there's another microchip. So things are getting smaller and smaller in just 10, 12 years, speeding up. And then we get the microprocessor, which is a whole bunch of chips together. Basically, that's a computer. Our microprocessor is a computer. It doesn't have a camera built into it or microphones or a screen, but basically that's what a computer is. It's a microprocessor. It's right there on a chip, and that was developed at Intel. Okay, so 10 years later, we are further and further ahead. Now, as we get into the 1970s, we get a whole new group of people. Remember, the country in the 1960s and 1970s starts filling up with all sorts of anti-authority, anti-war, hippie, college students, and all of that, right? So the country is really changing a lot, and the people who get into computing are going to reflect all that. They're going to be a little unorthodox. They're going to be going in, in sandals and bare feet and beards and all that kind of stuff. It's not going to be this sort of buttoned-down white shirt and a tie world in the computer industry. And I'm sort of going to be conflating computing and the internet. They're really linked. They are different, but they are really linked nevertheless. So computers and the internet. And now we have ARPANET, and that is a computer network, and it is funded by the government and developed at universities. So that is an important relationship. Government money is going to fund a lot of amazing innovation, including the internet. The internet was basically funded and run not really run, but put together by the government. Okay, you have to have money. Even Texas Instruments, even Intel, you got to have money. And if you're at universities and things, if you can write a grant to get money for your department for, say, finding a cure for a virus, then you are worth your weight in gold writing that grant. And that means money, and money means development and progress and probably profits. Okay, so the military thought, and this is during the Cold War, during the 50s and 60s, that if the enemy took out one of our main cities, Washington, D.C., or New York City, something like that, that everything would fall apart. Everything would fall apart. And so they thought that it would be a great idea to have it not like a hub going out, like the spokes on a wheel, like a hub, that if you take out the hub, then the wheel goes down and nothing works. And they wanted it to be more like our highway system. If you think of our highway system, the interstate and all the roads and everything, how we get around, if you are trying to get from point A to point B and the bridge is out, or there's a flood, or it's under construction, you just take an alternate route, and you can still get there. If you're trying to get somewhere on the 10 or the 91 and it's a delay, then you take an alternate route. And that's the way they wanted the internet to be. And that's the way it is, right? That's the way it is. It's not central. All roads don't have to go through one central point, and same for the internet. So ARPANET, Advanced Research Protocol, something like that. I'm sorry, I don't have the whole thing, but it is very, very important in all this, and it was really instigated by the government. 1971, we get email, electronic mail, and this is Ray Tomlinson, and it's just by chance that we use @ or even #, any of that stuff. It's just, if you look at your keyboard right now, look at your keyboard, and what do you see? There's an exclamation point and an @ sign and a hashtag, which used to be called the £. There's a $, percentage, ampersand, right? It's all there, and people are just going to assign a function. Okay, they don't want to assign it to H or J or 8 because they already have things to do, and so they're looking for symbols and things like that that don't really have much of anything else to do. Maybe the / or / and that can get assigned, right? So he and probably late one night, grad student, just looking at the keyboard thinking, I need to separate the person's name with the domain, and let's just try @ That's it. It was just some chance. So, and he did more. He wrote code and stuff like that. He's not just some guy that picked @ to do stuff, but I just wanted to kind of let you know that that's how random it can be. This stuff is done by grad students for the most part, and they're writing code and staying up late all night and drinking coffee and Red Bull and all that kind of. They didn't have Red Bull back then, but that's how stuff gets done in a very intensive and random sort of way. 1972, Atari begins the video game era. Okay, it looks like Space Invaders to me. I remember playing it many, many moons ago, and there we go. Of course, it's a nice posed photo, but I love the turtlenecks and the hair and all that. It's a very 70s picture. Let's take a look at an early computer. There we go, the Altair 8800, and that's the first personal computer. Notice it doesn't have a screen or anything like that. It's because they're just looking to help get numbers and things like that. Now, this has an interesting story. I told you that a lot of the people that were working on computers were young and college student types, and Altair comes from a sci-fi movie from the 1950s. We might have seen it in class. I'm trying to remember if we did or not. It was Forbidden Planet, and one of those Forbidden Planets was Altair 6, maybe? I can't remember, but I know it was Altair. And they just liked it, and they decided, being sci-fi fans, let's call our first computer, let's call this device here the Altair. 1975, there's Bill Gates and Paul Allen from Microsoft. Okay, they've both gone on to do good stuff. And boy, they sure look young, don't they? 19, 20, 21, something like that. And here's another couple of young people. There we go. Steve Jobs on the right, Steve Wozniak on the left, and they form Apple, and they launch Apple that year. There's a control board, something like that. They have, I mean, all these guys have amazing stories, what they contributed, and the others, some of them are good at really kind of schmoozing and coming up with ideas. They're not really always code writers. Bill Gates could write code. Paul Allen too. Steve Wozniak was more the tech guy in Apple, and Steve Jobs was the concept guy. Let's see if we can do this, right? And it is a different skill. People that write codes, what do you want me to write a code for? Well, I want you to write a code so that this will do that. Oh, okay, right? But that's the big picture. There are the big picture guys, and then there are the guys that get into the trenches and make it happen. Okay, let's build something that can do something, okay? And we end up with a car or a tank or an airplane, right? Somebody's got to conceive of the idea, and somebody else is going to have to make it happen. Okay, so that is in the 1970s. There is a momentous meeting in 1979. Steve Jobs goes to Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. Books have been written about this stuff. We're going through it quite briefly, and he sees a graphic user interface. And a mouse. They also did LaserJet printers. They did all sorts of amazing stuff at the Xerox Palo Alto, which is on the west coast there, right near south of San Francisco, near Stanford and around in there. Most of Xerox is on the East Coast, and the people out on the West Coast, again, they were these weirdos that weren't working on the bread and butter of Xerox, which was copy machines and things like that. They were working on these other odd machines. They were thought to be maybe not particularly useful out there on the West Coast, but they came up with so many amazing things, and then Xerox didn't really know what to do with it all. They didn't quite give it away, but they almost gave it away, really. They could have trademarked and all that, their amazing devices, but they were really concentrating on printers and things like that. If it wasn't going to help printers, then they didn't much care about it. There is a first mouse made out of wood there, and plugged into the computer, all that. And Steve Jobs saw that there was a deal that Jobs was going to give shares of stock to the people at Xerox. It was sort of a trade that you can have some shares in our new company, and we will trade those shares for some of your technology. Show us what you're up to, and we will give you some shares. So Steve Jobs, one fine afternoon, drove over, I think with one other person, and they showed him some stuff. And he got back and he said, deal's off. And they said, why? He said, you didn't really show me the good stuff. And they said, yeah, you're right. Come on back. Yeah, it's true. It's a true story. So he went back and they took him into the back room and showed him the mouse. And the graphic user interface, that's what PCs call call Windows. I'm sorry, that's what they call Windows. And so having graphics instead of just a whole bunch of numbers on the screen, that was a really big deal to see graphics. You know what, let me jump to one of those. There we go. So that's really what computers look like. Okay, that's what it was. No graphics, no pretty pictures, no icons, none of that. Okay, until Steve Jobs saw some of this stuff with a graphic user and a mouse, and you click on a symbol, right? You don't just type in. You're not just typing. Okay, active, comma, 75, 758, M, space, right? You're not just typing, you're clicking. And that is a big thing, right? That's really a big thing. And that is part of the system that's going to allow people to click on the screen, not just type on a keyboard and have stuff appear on the screen. So Xerox PARC, they invented the personal computer, the mouse, the laser printer, Ethernet, all sorts of amazing stuff. And yeah, it's kind of not, you know, not exactly hippies, but sure, beanbag type people with long hair and whatnot. Okay, so there they are, these and that's the way it is back in the 1970s. The people that are working on computers and lots of other stuff too are a little offbeat. Let's say. And there's wonderful books about this stuff if you're into it. They're really cool stories, I think. I love that stuff. And so anyway, they're trying to get away from this. So 1980s, fiber optic cable becomes standard. So that is partly why it is called Silicon Valley, because silica, sand, basically that's what sand is. Okay, sand is fine granules of silica that the waves wash over and make it real small and granular and all that, and that is so important. I had no idea how important glass or silicon was until it was explained to me, or I saw really a cool documentary, and they said, yeah, those are microscopes, telescopes, reading glasses, all sorts of stuff, right? All sorts of stuff. And now they can build cable. I don't want to call it wires. They can build cables out of it, and it can travel at the speed of light. It travels stuff on fiber optic cable, goes much faster, and it can carry much more information than copper, right? Copper is pretty much what everybody was using. Cable TV, those were copper wires, computers, all that stuff. Copper, copper, copper. It's a good conductant. It's cheaper than gold, which is an even better conductant, but it has its drawbacks. So fiber optic cable comes in, and it is another big step. Okay, that you can have developments in all sorts of places, from code writers to technology like that, like just developing a new cable, right? That's a big thing. So Steve Jobs, there he is with his first Macintosh computer in 1984. And just for fun, I've linked to that ad again. You can watch it again. I know we talked about it when we talked about advertising, but it's only a minute. If you want to watch it again, there you go. And when we see this, it really says a lot, because look, that is not those green letters, those pale green letters. Okay, this is what computers used to look like. And this is what computers are going to look like. Okay, that's a big thing. And Steve Jobs wanted computers not only for scientists, he wanted them for artists. That was his thing. And when he was in college, he took a class in, I think, calligraphy. He loved calligraphy. He loved all that stuff. So when you are going to make a document and you go up there to pick your font, and the drop-down menu shows you like 100 different fonts, you can thank Steve Jobs for that. He's the one that he loved fonts, all those different kinds of fonts, artists, and all the art that you can do on a computer, and graphics, right? All that graphic stuff for artists or musicians, right? All sorts of different kinds of artists, visual artists and music artists, and all the different kind of artists. And that's picking colors. I mean, you know, mathematicians don't care what color the font is. What do they care? I just need it to compute. Okay, but artists and people like that, and designers and so on, and you know, that's how we start getting into Photoshop and all that kind of stuff, right? That all starts right here with graphics and stuff on a computer. And there we have a floppy disk drive and so on. There's the mouse, right? That's the mouse. One click. He wanted it very simple. He wanted very simple, no right, left, or any of that kind of stuff. He wanted a very simple mouse there. And there he is, rarely in a suit. You hardly ever see Steve Jobs in a suit. He always wore that black turtleneck and jeans and so on. 1986, the National Science Foundation, that's not a typo, that $S, that is a big thing. That is government funding. Those are the people that write grants and things like that. And when the government says, let's spend money on something, then that's how you develop a cure for a virus, or that's how you develop the internet, right? It costs money, not just brains. Not just brains. You got to pay these grad students to do it. You got to pay for test tubes and fiber optic cables and computers. All those scientists that are working on biological solutions need computers, right? All the people that are eventually going to discover, how to get a vaccine for this or a vaccine for that, they're going to do that on computers in a lot of it. Okay, and labs and test tubes and all that stuff costs money. All that stuff, and lab rats, all that stuff. Money, money, money. And the government opens up the floodgates and starts funding all this computer internet stuff. Okay, so big help. Tim Berners-Lee, he is the guy that developed the World Wide Web. He was working on a large project, and he was trying to keep track of all of the papers that people were submitting, and they were in different formats and different languages and this and that and the other, and he was trying to figure out a way to organize the whole thing, and he came up with the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web is part of the internet. It is not the internet. They're not the same thing. The internet is quite a bit bigger than the World Wide Web. But the World Wide Web is the graphic part, in large part. So if you see a www, that's World Wide Web, and if you don't see a www in the URL up at the top, then it's not part of the World Wide Web, but it's going to be part of the internet. Hypertext. And hypertext is also very important, especially for non-scientist type people trying to navigate. Remember, you're trying to get from somewhere to somewhere else, and so you have a choice, right? You can either type in http://www.ncsa.vivc.edu/ right? That's a lot of typing, okay? That's what you're going to have to type. That's how you navigate the internet in the early days. I remember doing that. http://www. And then wherever you want to go. Major League Baseball, MLB, Disney, right? And so these guys say, how about you just click on these blue letters right here and go there? Wouldn't that be nice? So when we see hypertext, right? When you see hypertext, then you go there. It's the shortcut. It's like going through the wormhole. Okay, you don't have to travel all that distance. You just and you're there. Very nice. So this is a browser, Mosaic, Mark Andreessen, and browsers are what is going to connect a computer to the World Wide Web and the internet, right? You need a browser to do that. Otherwise, your computer is going to compute, right? You're going to compute, or you're going to possibly write a letter, something like that. But if you want to connect it to something, it's going to get connected to the internet and the World Wide Web, then you need a browser to do that, because that's not one of the functions that a computer does off the top. And so that is going to lead to all sorts of other browsers and things, but that is the first one there. 1993 in September, America Online and their Think CEO, Steve Case, and they are the first to offer consumer access to the internet. So let's talk about that a little bit. Most students, if they were in the sciences, would get online when they became freshmen. You're a freshman, go to college, here's your first computer, and you're going to start working on your math or your physics or something like that. Not if you're probably a theater student or something like that. But if you are in the sciences and you are a college freshman, that is where you're going to get online for the very first time in your life. And people that were on the internet back then used to dread September, because in September, all the newbies would be on the internet. Oh no, here come a bunch of people. They don't know what they're doing. They're going to ask stupid questions and blah, 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 blah. Every September. And then they eventually figure it out, and you'd be on a computer for a number of years. And then when you graduated, you'd either have a job somewhere, Northrop or something, where you'd still be on the internet with computers, or that would be it. That would be it. You probably wouldn't have a computer anymore, if this is back in the 1980s or so. So America Online, they have literally millions of disks to load on the app, the AOL app. They're everywhere. They're at every single 7-Eleven. They're at every single place you can go. There's piles of them. They're free. Grab one, put it in your computer, and you can launch America Online. And then your computer would be connected to a phone line. Okay, your computer, all the computers back then were connected to phone lines. It's called dial-up. Your computer would dial a local telephone number. Otherwise, you're going to pay long-distance charges. And so if you're going to be on the internet, it's going to cost you. And I remember being on the internet back in 93, 92, and so you would see that in your phone bill. And America Online, they allowed you to be online, oh gosh, what was it? Maybe, and you're not going to believe this, but I think it was at first 5 hours a month and then 10 hours a month. And you would pay a fee to America Online, and then you'd have to pay your phone bill. And to make a local phone call might cost you 6 cents a minute. So that's going to add up. And so I remember back then, I would get online and you would get all your email, and then you would get back offline because you didn't want to dig into your 5 hours or something like that. And then you could read all your email, you could compose all your answers to your email, and then you'd get back online again and send it all out. Yes, not much in the way of graphics or pictures or anything like that. It was all for communicating and computing and things like that. Okay, so, and that is dial-up. It's pretty slow. You would have a modem, and a modem is a modulator and a demodulator. Modem. And that's the way it was through the 90s. Pretty slow dial-up. Now, there are still people that have dial-up. Your computer is plugged in to the phone line in your office, something like that. And so in September of 1993, AOL let people out of AOL. Now, AOL was, I guess you could compare it to like maybe Facebook or something like that. It's like a big walled-in garden. It's a beautiful garden, lots of nice stuff there, but there's a big wall all the way around it. Okay, and to get outside the wall or to get from the wall to inside was really hard to do. So you could go to AOL, you could go to games, there they are, you could go to any of this stuff, but this is all inside AOL. This was not in the internet. Okay, you could go anywhere, lifestyle, sports, all that kind of stuff, travel, workplace, that's all AOL. And then in September of 1993, they opened up the gates and let all of the AOL subscribers out into the internet. Not just students, not just scientists, but everybody. So that was a pretty big deal, right? Pretty big day. And I remember getting emails from Steve Case saying, yes, the internet is coming, just wait for it. And then all of a sudden, you could get out and see the whole big wide world. Okay, now I know a lot of companies would like you to stay, they'd like you to stay at Facebook. You can watch videos at Facebook, and you can do this, listen to music, and you can do movies and all that kind of stuff. You can do everything you need to do without ever leaving Facebook. Well, they'd like us to do that. We're probably not going to do that. But that's the way AOL was. You could do all of this wonderful stuff and not leave AOL. But of course, adventuresome people want to get out there and see what's out there in the big, wide, wicked world, all that other kind of stuff for adults and so on and so forth. Okay, and that was September, and people call that the September that never ended because there were newbies all year round, not just college freshmen. Lots and lots of people back then could get onto the internet. And this is early AOL. You recognize, file, edit, all that stuff, sign off, help, hypertext, okay, hypertext, wherever you want to go, okay. Early internet in the early 90s. So this is starting to change the technology. Mostly we have, in the early days, in the 70s and in the 80s, there is a mainframe. I worked at a medical center in the 1980s. I was in the video department, but I worked at a medical center, and of course they wanted to keep all their patient records, all that kind of stuff on a mainframe computer. So in offices and departments, there would be a terminal, okay? A terminal, not a computer, but a terminal. Terminal from terminus means to end, so it would go from wherever the mainframe was upstairs somewhere to wherever you were, and you could get all that information that was only on that main frame. And whether you worked at Boeing or Northrop or Pfizer or wherever, there would be a mainframe and there would be a terminal, and it would all be in that building or maybe nearby buildings. You weren't actually out into the outside world. It was just that world of whatever company you worked at. And now the terminal is going to change into personal desktop computers, PCs. Okay, personal computer that you're going to have on your own desktop, and it's not terminating the end of the mainframe. And of course, smaller, 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 from desktop to laptop to all that, right? So what we see here, this is interesting too. Most of the things, if you want to type a letter or any correspondence or any of that word processing stuff, it's going to come out on paper, computer paper. And that computer paper, let's take a close look at it, looks like this. So if you ever see any of that, that's actual computer paper. This is the sprocket holes to feed it through, almost like the sprocket holes that you'd have on motion picture film to pull the paper through. And it was all on one long, every other page was full, like a fan, right? It was like a fan, folded, folded, folded. So when it came out, it would be maybe 5 or 6 pages, and then you'd have to tear the pages apart one by one, and then you'd probably tear off, there are little perforations along here too. Then you'd tear off the sprocket holes, and that's what you'd have. That's your letter. That's what you'd send out. Dot matrix computer paper, okay? And of course, people could have much smaller versions of this in their home, but basically, and it's all one long, it's like a roll of toilet paper, basically, only instead of being on a roll, it's sort of folded back and forth like a fan. But then it would come out, you'd have to grab all that stuff and start tearing it up, right? Tearing it, separating it, so that you'd have something that would fit in an envelope. And there you go. And notice, you might also notice that the font it's that one font. This is the stuff that would have been off of one of those green computers. Where is that? Yeah, there we go. Right, that would have come out, and it would have been printed, and it would come out looking like that. Okay, so that's the computer world. Now I know all this stuff seems ancient, and how could anybody live in that world with this paper and no access and Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff. And just remember that in 50 years, people are going to think the same thing about 2020 or 2021 or 2019. They're going to think the same thing. How could they live in that world? Look at those funny, strange little they called those smartphones. That's not a smartphone. Oh my God. How could, hey grandma, hey grandpa, how did you think that wonderful Apple or Android iPhone 11 was anything special? Okay, and that's the way we think back to this, right? We keep thinking back. How could you have worked on this and dial up and all that kind of stuff? And remember, when you are a parent or a grandparent, even better, people are going to think the same thing of your youth. They're going to think the same thing of your youth. How could you could sit on that phone and crack the screen? I don't believe it. How ancient is that? Ha, ha, ha. Okay, so again, it looks funny and ancient when we go back far enough, but if we go forward, just imagine in 30, 40 years, all our stuff is going to look just like that. All right, so moving through the 90s, Amazon, Jeff Bezos. That company lost money for like 15 or 20 years. They lost money, they kept borrowing, borrow, okay, but hardly getting ahead. Now, Jeff, I believe, is the richest human on planet Earth, I believe, somewhere north of $140 billion, maybe something like that. He's actually still making money. Lots of people are losing money during the plague years, the virus years. But Amazon is so well positioned. He is still making quite a bit of money. And that is called e-commerce, E for electronic, so e-commerce. Also in the 90s, we have Clinton and Gore, there they are, signing the Telecom Act. That is going to deregulate telcos, telephone companies. It's going to lower phone rates, and cable companies are going to compete, and so you can get your cable TV from your Verizon phone company and so on. And also importantly, your phone rate is going to go down, and that means being on the internet is going to be cheaper. You're not spending 5 or 6 cents every minute to be on the internet. Okay, it's not just AOL saying that we can only get you up there for 10 hours a month, believe it or not, 10 hours a month, but you don't want to be on for much more than 10 hours a month because you're going to be paying 6, 7, 8, 10 cents a minute. Now, 1996, all these rates go down, 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 and it's fantastic, and everybody is, again, another step getting people on the internet at a decent price. Not just a big company, okay? They don't have to worry about this at a big pharmaceutical company or an aerospace company. They're just going to be on the internet. Everybody's going to be on, and they're going to pay for it. But if you're going to be on the internet at home, you don't want to be spending, 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks a month just to be on the internet. 1998, Google comes out. And if you were in my mass media class in 1998, you would have heard about Google from me because I read about it, thought it was pretty cool. A lot of my students didn't have computers in 1998, but if they had one, or more likely going to the library, then I told them in my mass media class, yes, you got to try this new search engine. It's pretty good. And there is Sergey, I think he's Sergey, it would be Sergey, I guess, in Russian, but Sergey Brin, Larry Page, and those are the guys that worked on these search engines and all the amazing stuff that it takes to do that. It's a lot more complicated than you might think. With algorithms and so on. If, then, if, then, if, then. It's basically what algorithms are doing. Okay, so we've met Jeff Bezos. We've met the Google people. Let's meet Mark Zuckerberg. And he was just this kid, this boyish kid, 19, 20 years old, still at Harvard, just like Jobs and Wozniak and Gates and all these guys. They were young, barely in their 20s, and he got an idea. Partly it's a little debatable how much of it was his idea and how much of it was some other people's ideas, but he was a code writer and he could do that. Harvard had a thing called the Facebook, and they just had photos of all the students at Harvard, so you could see, hey, he's hot, hey, she's hot, and that was the Facebook, and so he, being a young male, wanted to know about females and if they were in a relationship or not in a relationship or whatever, and that's what Facebook was all about. Was really only for college students. You had to have a .edu email address, or you couldn't get into Facebook after it sort of left from Harvard. It was in the Ivy League there, and then it went out. So only college students, only young, hopefully single college students, and part of that whole thing was there before the news feed and before all that other kind of stuff. Are you in a relationship or not? And so forth, right? Before people were uploading photos or any of that kind of stuff. And so there is a movie about the early days of all this, The Social Network. You can watch it for extra credit. And it's a good movie, good drama. Yeah, check it out. So making the internet a mass medium, and we have talked about some of this stuff, so let's go through it here. We have the World Wide Web, and that is going to make it more visual. That's a big thing, right? Some people, they don't mind just dealing with words and numbers, but a lot of the rest of us would like to see some nice pretty pictures, okay, and icons and graphics and all that kind of stuff. So hypertext, links, that's very helpful. Browsers, of course, that's going to be very helpful. There we have the Firefox and Google Chrome and Apple Safari and all that. Those are the browsers. That's what's going to connect us. There is the infamous AOL disk piles and piles for Windows or Mac. Okay, and that is another thing that, you know, back in the 90s, it was a big deal if you were Mac or PC, because it was almost like a whole nother language. Mac or PC programs, word processing, all that stuff you'd have to buy either for Mac or for PC. And when the internet really started gaining traction in the late 90s, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Nobody on the internet didn't care if you were Mac or PC, and so that was a big thing. That was a big help for Apple. Apple was 9 or 10% of the market, and PCs. Microsoft was like 90% of the market. I mean, it was a big difference between the two. And the internet and Apple and devices. Microsoft was all about code and things like that, and Apple also was about devices. So the internet, thanks to the internet and so on, consumer access, September 93, the September that never ended, thanks to AOL. Phone deregulation. Okay, so your phone getting, you know, through your computer, modem, I assume that's the modem right there, floppy disks, all that kind of stuff, the hard drive, there we go, that's a nice computer setup somewhere in the 90s. Broadband, that also, big step forward. We can carry lots of information, and video, right? There's no video really on the internet. There's no video on the internet before, or very little, we'll say very little, before about 2002, 3, 4, something like that. I remember when Lord of the Rings was coming out, the 3 Lord of the Rings movies, and fans like myself who were interested in the movie, wanted to see the trailer. So you would go online, you would find the trailer, you would download it, you'd hit download, you'd go to bed for 7 or 8 hours, and you'd wake up the next morning and it would be downloaded and you could watch the 2-minute trailer. Yes, that's how long it took to download a 2-minute video. Okay, practically all night. So video was very slow, and until, even with early broadband, it was still pretty slow. Okay, certainly not with dial-up. I don't think you're going to get video with dial-up, but even early broadband, very slow. There's no end in sight. Don't think that we're at the end of anything. Okay, don't think, oh, look at those funny floppy disks and look at those funny zip disks and so on, right? Yeah, and all our stuff is going to look just as ancient as that in 30 or 40 years. So no end in sight. Important part of all this is venture capital, VC, and this is startup money for investing in new ideas and inventions. And what does that mean? Well, banks only like to lend money to a sure thing. They don't like to lose money. They can't afford to lose money. They have lots of consumers' money in there. They love to lend money for things that if the payment isn't made, they can take it back, such as cars and homes. Okay, you don't make your car payment, the bank can take your car. That is a pretty safe bet for the bank. If you don't make your mortgage payment, the bank can take your house. That's very safe. What about a new computer company? Well, what are you going to take? Fiber optic cables? I mean, what can they take? They just felt very insecure about all that stuff, especially in the early days. They felt very insecure about cable TV, because it was just satellite dishes and copper wire, and copper's worth money, but not that much. And so it was hard to get investment money, startup money, to buy servers and things and hire people and all that. But some people like Mark Andreessen made lots and lots of money with some of their work on the internet, like the browser, right? Mark made tons of money off of Mosaic and the subsequent browsers and things. And he had more money than he needed. He had way more money than he needed. So he crazy ideas. And if he lost $10 million or $50 million, it wasn't a big thing, right? He had plenty. He had a couple billion. So these are venture capitalists, okay? They're not like banks, and they can afford to lose money. Hopefully they're going to make money, okay? For every 10 or 20 losing propositions, eventually Twitter or something like that's going to come along, and they're going to make millions and millions and billions of dollars back. Okay, so venture capital, not banks. They're sort of doing the job of a bank, but they're taking more chances for sure. Now, they're not just giving it away. You got to have something. They're smart people. They know about codes and the internet, and you got to have a business plan. You can't just be a computer geek. You got to have somebody that knows how to run a company, probably some older guy from a real company, from Coke or something like that, or Pepsi, right? And you got to have them come in. That's what they had. That's what they ended up doing at Apple, and that's what they ended up doing at Google, right? They got some old guy in his 40s or 50s that knew about money and banks and all that kind of stuff, and wasn't some long-haired, geeky computer nerd with a brilliant idea. Moore's law, this is a real person, and he said computing power, microprocessor speed would double every year and a half to 2 years, and so far he's been right. And I don't understand all of this exactly from the 1960s, but we do see processor speed, and this is already more than 10 years ago, but it's about every whatever, it's doubling, Pentium 2, 3, 4, all that kind of stuff. Processor speed is going up. 1965 data, memory, and the microprocessor. So that's Moore's law. A killer app is so cool and so desirable that you will buy the machine to run the app. Okay, it's kind of the reverse. Normally you get cable TV and then you watch MTV or something like that, or you get a computer and then you, okay. Now here's this something that so many people wanted. They wanted to be able to do their taxes, and QuickBooks was this amazing new thing that allowed you to plug in information and do your taxes. So people bought computers to get QuickBooks. Okay, it sounds reverse. People bought computers to get QuickBooks, and some people got cable TV so that they could get HBO. Okay, that is a killer app. It is so good and so killer that you buy a machine, and I'm sure there are video games like that. I couldn't name off a fantastic video game, but there are video games out there. People will buy their very first whatever, PlayStation or something, to play that game. That game is a killer app. A tipping point is when 50% or thereabouts of consumers get a product, and then we get economies of scale. And so now, Apple computer of 1984, I think it cost $5,000 or $6,000 in today's money, $5,000 or $6,000, maybe even $10,000. Okay, and so who can afford that? Well, a few rich people and companies. And then as more and more people get it, they're making more and more, they're buying more and more parts and computer screens and fiber optic cable and all that, and the cost goes down, down, down. If we just think of McDonald's in the very early days when they're only making a few thousand hamburgers per day versus hundreds of millions of hamburgers per day. And that's the way it is for all technology. That's what economies of scale is all about. When you get hundreds and hundreds and thousands of this stuff, the cost goes down, 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 and somewhere around 50%, whether it's a television or a radio or a DVD player or a computer or a smartphone, the cost is going to drop, drop, drop when a lot of people already have it. So we need those rich people to buy those $4,000 flat screen TVs so that eventually the price can go down to $500 or $600 for the rest of us. Web 2.0, and this is kind of an older term now, but this is when it becomes interactive, especially with fiber optics, when we users and consumers are uploading. Right? Basically, 2.0 means we are uploading. We're not just downloading. In the early days, all through the 90s and the early 2000s, you would go to Major League Baseball or you'd go to Disney and you'd look at what they had to show you, or you'd look at a trailer and look at the beautiful trailer that they had for you. But then with MySpace, yes, MySpace, YouTube, they are nothing, not to mention Facebook, without us uploading. Right? We are content creators, and that's what Web 2.0 is. It's about content creation, not just consumption. Massive multiplayer online role-playing game, that's part of this whole mix, and they are getting bigger and bigger and faster and more amazing. It is a worldwide phenomenon, and very interestingly, as the world turns and game players wake up and they get online, maybe in China or Korea, and then the US and then Europe. So the world just keeps spinning and game players get on and go to sleep and get off and all that kind of stuff. And it's really quite interesting, the phenomenon of playing online from different parts of the world and different time zones and all the whole rest of it. It really is. Okay, so that is most of our history there of the internet, and it sort of takes us up to, more or less where we are today. And so next week we will be talking about viral videos and memes and deepfake and the digital divide, right? All that. We're going to talk about all the controversy and so on that the internet and computers entail today. So I've got a few links. One of them is Generation Like, and that is in large part about the commodification of users on the internet. I think it's a really good video. It's from PBS. It's an hour. Normally, I would show the first half this week, and I would show the second half next class or next week. So that's the way I would do it. You don't have to watch the whole thing. And I've linked to it both weeks. And then I've got the Mac 1984 ad and the Social Network trailer and the Imitation Game trailer there for you. And then next week, we have viral videos and memes, and that's where you would watch the second half of Generation Like. Okay, thank you so much, and we will be back very shortly to finish off computers and the internet and mass media, our very last class before our third test is next week. Next class, I should say, next class.